Welcome, Jennifer,
Thank
to
you.
S4.
It's good to be here.
I want to kind of set the stage before we get into the questions here.
Yeah.
Why I invited someone with expertise in reputation management to S4. And I don't know if any of you have run into this, but I've run into this a number of times where you're with an asset owner, you envision a scenario, and you say, if this happened, what would be the impact to financials, safety, customer impact, environment, and reputation? Now, if financial or customer impact is high, you might be looking for some consequence reduction action. You might put, let's say, if an expensive piece of equipment was at risk, you might put in a protection measure so it couldn't be destroyed. Or you might improve your recovery. But you'd find a way to push those down from high and catastrophic down to moderate or low. But then you get into this scenario where you say, well, if this bad thing happens, it really doesn't affect us. We don't lose much money. No one is hurt. The customers aren't without their product or service for very long. No environmental damage. But you say the reputation would be high. Even though the actual impact is low, there's a fear in the company that they would suffer such a reputational loss that it would be a disaster. So I wanted to invite someone in to say, how do we push reputation down in this sort of thing? So maybe we'll just start with that broad question is, if you see a chart like this and you want to push reputation down, where do you start with something like that?
Yeah. Well, I will say, and thank you so much, Dale, for having me. I really appreciate it. It's interesting to be a communicator at a conference like this, right? Because my entire lens is through that lens of brand and communication and reputation. And I think this is increasingly a situation that we see. Now, that said, there are a lot of times when it's not.
Sure.
Right? And so that sanctity of human life and catastrophic loss, preparing for that is so essential. But really what people, I think, misunderstand about reputation is that it's an ongoing practice and it drives value. So inherently, trust that we have with one another and with organizations creates value. And so there are some estimates by folks that, corporate market value, 63% of an organization's market value is based on their reputation. And so that's a huge, huge number. And when you think about trust and what happens with companies who have trust versus companies who don't, there's a significant difference. So Deloitte has done a study, for instance, and it showed that companies who have trust outperform their peers by 400%. That's a huge number. So when we look at reputation, we need to think about how do we maintain reputational health across the spectrum. And in some ways, it's no different than cybersecurity from the standpoint of you need to be measuring it regularly, you need to be monitoring it regularly, and then you need to understand its inherent value in the marketplace.
Well, and maybe let's jump in on that point. How do you measure it? Because I mean, we see these broad things, and when I ask some of those customers that said it's a high, well, what does that mean? And they just have a very, very broad view. Kind of the same problem we have with security measurements. It's a lot of hand waving, but are there actual metrics that people use?
There absolutely are. And I would say there's huge innovation happening in the world of measurement, just as with cyber. So when you're looking at this, you're really looking at the spectrum first of all of your stakeholders and understanding who all those stakeholders are. And I think the issue is too infrequently people understand, they don't understand what the current state is. So what are their perceptions? What are the beliefs that exist right now with legislators, with Congress, with oversight bodies, with maybe adversaries to the company? If there are adversaries out there who might be acting in certain ways, non-government organizations, customers. So you have to take that entire ecosystem, and then you have to understand the perceptions and beliefs about your organization. And what's happened is we have moved from this becoming a very difficult thing to do to being able to do it really with technology and innovation fairly easily. So companies like Edelman, which is a nationally, internationally recognized public relations firm, they do an annual study on reputation. Ipsos, which is a great market research firm, Ipsos does a lot of work on reputation management. And then there are new startups that are coming into the fray. I talked with a company yesterday by the name of Caliber, and they've got data-driven insights on reputation that are available in a dashboard on a regular basis.
So is this a score that they survey people continuously over time? Well, not continuously, but periodically over time, and ask them the same questions and see where they rate? Is there some industry standard way of doing that, or is this very tailored?
It is very tailored, and it has to be tailored because everyone's stakeholders are different. And so that's the important part of this, is that you need to understand who your particular stakeholders are, and then you need to measure that current state. But the thing to remember about this is, as perception shifts, value shifts. And if you're not measuring it, then you don't understand it. You simply look at something and say, well, we think that our reputation has taken a hit. But the reality is there are tools these days that will show us. And those tools will show you things like, we made an announcement and what the outcome of that was. For instance, if you decided as an organization that you were no longer going to do business in Russia and you pulled your operations and you made that announcement, you can then see in the dashboard the net effects of that in terms of perception change.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of what we see here is companies that haven't suffered an attack on OTR operations yet, but then they have their first one and they're kind of facing it for the first time. How do they even prepare their reputation management for this event that's never happened before, but could get them the lead story in the news around the world? As we see, that I mentioned in my opening statement, Aliquip Water was the lead story around the world, and it's this tiny little water utility. How does a company prepare to deal with that potential reputational hit?
Yeah. It's interesting because when you talk about crisis preparedness is really your first aid kit. So that's making sure you've got the first aid kit in the car ready to go in case of emergency. But your reputation management program is really an ongoing type of program. That is your health. That's actually making the investments on a daily basis. So I'm going to tell people there are really two things they ought to be doing. Number one, people need to understand how to measure the reputation, and they need to have an ongoing perception management program. But secondly, they need to make sure that they've got that first aid kit prepared. And that's things like an always-on 1-800 number. It's prepared spokespeople. It's hopefully bringing some of the technical people to the table. We're certainly seeing that more boards have CISO representation, and that's fantastic to see. But we need to have the right people who are prepped ahead of time, and they need to test their muscle strength, their muscle memory on response, really. You don't want to be finding out for the first time how you're going to respond to things as an organization when it's unfolding. So tabletop exercises, train spokespeople, regular communication to the media so you're not calling them for the first time, all of those things help.
And when you say tabletop exercise, that's something, again, this audience typically would do related to dealing with the attack,
Yes.
being the actual responders to figure out what happened, how they can get it back up and running, what do they need to do to prevent it from stopping or not happening again. When we're doing those sort of OT incident response exercises, I guess this would be more the crisis side, where do they fit into this exercise?
Well, and that's a big issue, because when you have silos, then you have problems, right? And so, again, just like cybersecurity, we need to increase our agility, break down those silos, and make sure that these folks are not just doing their tabletop exercises independent of and without some collaboration with the communications and the public affairs function, the lawyers. You need to have all the right folks in the room from the C-suite, but you also need to have that technical insight.
And I wouldn't expect you'd put a technical person out to talk to the press in general. I mean, maybe you would, but I would be nervous. A lot of the people that I know who might talk to the press, they might give them too much technical jargon or maybe details that they shouldn't. But on the other hand, when I see the response, the people that are talking about these events that have happened on OT, a lot of times I think if they had talked to the technical person, their response would have been a lot better. That really this terrible thing that everyone's worried about, they could have used words to explain why it couldn't have happened.
Yep.
But they kind of leave it halfway vague. How should the technical people talk to the people that are going to be dealing with the media and others? How can they get the message best across to maybe the people that you usually deal with?
Yeah, my sense of this is that every organization now should really have a cyber narrative. And if you don't feel as though that exists in your organization at more of a broader level, I would encourage people to go and drive that.
Well, that's an interesting term. I hadn't heard that. What's a cyber narrative?
It's really a story about what threats exist, your preparedness, your teams, and what you do on the daily in order to protect from that. Mm-hmm. And it's got to be balanced with reality, Dale. And this is where we get into issues with reputation management. Abraham Lincoln said about reputation, he said, character is the tree, mm-hmm. reputation is the shadow that it casts. And so when you think about that, where you get into problems with reputation is when your character, and perhaps in this instance it's how prepared you really are, is significantly different from the shadow that it casts, or the perception. That's where Boeing got in trouble, for instance. We think of Boeing as a culture of engineering excellence. We think of Boeing as a culture of safety. And then all of a sudden, here are the news stories. Well, the shadow that was cast is incredibly different from the tree that exists. So when you think about your cyber narrative, you want to be thinking about what can we confidently say? And you don't want to be too far out ahead of your skis, of course, mm-hmm. right? But a lot of times the corporate comms people are scared to say too much. And so I just encourage these conversations, because the more that the technical people can show up and inform, the more we'll be able to share realistic, right-sized information.
Yeah, I really like that concept of a cyber narrative. I know you don't get deep into the technical details, but I could imagine a cyber narrative talking about your safety and protection systems that could prevent these things from happening, your processes, your resilience, your ability to recover. Yep. And if you know, the S4 attendee audience and others in the community had gone back and forth and communicated that broad narrative, then when an event happens, you at least have that as a foundation. I think that's something I haven't seen that could be really useful.
Yeah, and it's about foundational work. It doesn't mean that that's going to be the magic answer forever, right? Or that is not going to change, but it's a way to kind of gauge what can we put pen to paper on and actually say in some storytelling. And I think in general, the industry could use more storytelling. I really enjoyed your opening piece where you talked about the fact that, you know, we need to talk more about our successes. And I think that's a very, very true thing in this industry.
Now, I gave you a couple of incidents to look at briefly. I'm sure you've noticed this, when something happens, you see some organizations say a lot, some don't say anything. And I thought one of the examples of someone who was very forward with their communication, you know, if anything, over-communicated, would be Norsk Hydro, the aluminum manufacturer. And they were giving updates all the time. They appeared to be, I wasn't on the inside, they appeared to be quite candid about what happened and what they were doing and what worked and what didn't work. And certainly the community loved it, you know, but we're not really Norsk Hydro customers. So the security people were cheering, saying, yes, that's the way to go. And then we had Clorox last year, which gave almost no details beyond the bare minimum they felt they had to do as a public company.
Yep.
Since we're not really well, maybe we're one of the elements you have to worry about reputation, but we're not their customers, we're not their suppliers, we're not their stockholders. Which approach is better for a company when they get hit with something like this?
You know, I think a lot of people would say as much as you can share in terms of transparency, and when it comes to threats, even sharing threat management information so you're seen as someone who is moving the industry forward, helping others to be prepared, that generally people love those responses. However, we have a very different climate here in the United States right now, particularly with what's happening with the SEC and their new guidelines. And really, Clorox was one of the first examples of a company who was dealing with those new SEC guidelines. And so what we saw is that they communicated what they could communicate each time, and that story continued to evolve a bit. The important thing about the story is that it didn't go back and contradict itself. And so it's really very dependent on what's going on, but I do think there's a difference between a company in Norway without those pressures that Clorox had. They really used it in Norway as an opportunity to get some great press, too. I mean, they came back and had an amazing Time magazine story that detailed everything top to bottom with a narrative about how the CEO woke up in the morning at 4 a.m., all of these details technically. And I think that's a swimming story to see. I don't know that most public companies are going to have the opportunity to be that forthright.
No, but do you think, is it geographical or is it public-private? So like, could a private US company take that approach in your view?
I think they absolutely could. I think they absolutely could. And I think those people are going to be seen as innovators, frankly.
Okay. And now you mentioned something, contradiction, that they didn't contradict themselves.
Yes.
One of the challenges is on, let's say, day one, day two, you might think you know, like you might believe you're going to get deliveries back up and running in 6 days. You know, you could say we have a plan tested and we can do it in 6 days, and on day 4 you realize there was something that your plan didn't consider. Because a lot of times these things have never happened before, so you drill, and then you learn, oh, here's a new thing I didn't think about happening.
Yep.
So how do you balance that, wanting to share the information when you can and not wanting to contradict yourself potentially later on?
Yeah, it is a big challenge, and it's something we spend a lot of time working in the tabletop exercises on, is how to not get out, again, over your skis in that regard, and make promises that you can't keep. And so it's a very delicate dance between restoring trust, telling people when things are going to be back online, and when you need to be realistic about the fact that things are unfolding. This is an active state, and those are really the best statements. You know, the best public statements are the ones that explain, there's been an event, we're working on it, here's how we've prepared, more updates soon. And then committing to the fact that you are going to meet the timeline, at least for those updates. So it's a delicate dance, certainly.
Where does this, you talked about reputation management and crisis communication as, there's like two different things. Do you do any reputation preparation for the expectation there will be a crisis? Like, do you try to make people aware that this could happen, or do you just try to keep it quiet until it happens and then deal with it the best you can?
Well, I think this is a really interesting question, particularly in this sector.
Yeah.
Because it has to do with, again, the tree and the shadow that is cast. So I think it's interesting to think about how much confidence can we give people and how much trust can we give people. But we've really moved from people being worried about my Target card and my information being stolen to, is my water safe? And is the electrical grid going to stay up? So I think it's a shift for public perception around the severity of these issues. We're seeing more and more news stories that are educating the public. And of course, with Colonial Pipeline and stuff like this, the public awareness is increasing. And in some ways, I think we need to lean into that. You mentioned decreasing the FUD during your opening. And I think there is an opportunity to decrease the FUD while increasing just awareness of what this industry does on a daily basis, how those network systems are, separated off so that there's, safety valves. I think the industry would really benefit from that. And that to me is an ongoing public relations program. That is an industry leadership program that really does a lot to bolster American understanding.
And maybe that ties back to the cyber narrative that you talked about. So maybe
It does.
you get your narrative out there over time, and then if something happens, and you can go back to say, as we have said,
Right.
before, this could happen, and this is how we're prepared.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things, I mean, this is kind of real politics sort of thing, but one of the reasons I invited Jennifer here is she has done work with electric utilities, with the Department of Energy and such, so she's one of the rare people in her field who has actually interacted with some of the people that own systems like this. In a way, is there a difference between a utility company that has captive customers? Like for me, if I'm unhappy with Maui Electric, which is part of Hawaiian Electric, I guess I can buy more solar, but I'm kind of stuck, or I can't get water from anyone else. Whereas, if we'll go back to Clorox, they lost shelf space to other customers, and people tried other products because they couldn't buy their product. When you're in reputation, do you ever say, I don't have to worry as much about reputation with these ones with captive clients?
We never stop worrying about reputation. And I guess what I would just say to you is, if your reputational position is our customers don't have a choice,
yeah,
that's not a great reputational position to stand on.
I don't think I'd ever want to say that, but
I understand, but I do think that ultimately, at the end of the day, we have a responsibility to our customers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a moral and an ethical responsibility to customers to take the steps to have a cyber resiliency, program, and to really invest in that in a meaningful way. And conversely, I think you absolutely have to be communicating about that. And I think you need to build people's confidence, let them know what you're doing as an organization, and keep that flow of information. The very best communication programs in the world are really two-way communication programs. And so inasmuch as they're about telling stories and telling narratives and influencing public perception, they're also about listening and understanding what's coming back. So
I wonder, though, if I think about it, like those companies have to worry about regulatory boards.
They do.
Their state legislatures, they're the people that set their rates and things like that. So you actually might have a slightly different customer for reputation, because those are the people, and do you ever create like these customer lists and say, how are we managing reputation for the people we deliver product to, the people that can affect us legally if we don't do the right thing?
Well, and that's exactly it. I mean, you've struck on reputation management at its broadest level, which is you look at it through that 360 lens. Mm-hmm. And again, there are regulators, there are folks in Congress, there are oversight bodies. And so you always have publics to answer to. Mm-hmm. And there are always ramifications if you mess up with them. And they can be very, very costly ramifications.
Yeah, I want to go back to that chart. Let me see if it's still there. What do you do when the executives think it's a high, but the reputational management professionals say it really isn't a high? You're just scared. Yeah. How do you help them level set? Because I have seen this where I've seen them put it up at catastrophic, and you look at catastrophic, it could be, they say could end the business or something, something like that, and a minor cyber attack is at that level. What could we do to help executives better match what a professional might say the real reputational risk is?
I think right sizing is really about, again, understanding impact. And so, we tend to prepare for the worst.
Right.
That's just a rule of thumb
Yeah,
in our profession.
as does our community.
That's a rule of thumb. We prepare for the worst. However, I think there's an opportunity with media monitoring and everything else to look at events that have happened and to do some calming of the C-suite over some of this stuff when you realize how frequently it happens and how much it is covered in the media. And that to me is really an indicator, again, of, well, we're not the only one. We're not the only ones who are dealing with this issue. This is a global issue. And the fact that events do happen, we kind of need to build our agility around that, right? So that it doesn't feel so catastrophic every time, that it's more of, okay, we've really built resilience, we've built agility, and we've built responses.
Okay. Well, maybe as a last question, you mentioned Colonial Pipeline.
Yeah.
So imagine the next Colonial Pipeline comes, the CEO gets invited to testify in front of Congress. What would you, as someone crisis management, reputational management, what would you tell that CEO? How should they prepare to go out there? What should be their attitude and preparation as they deal with, you've seen these hearings, a lot of times people are trying to make points, they're trying to score points. They're not typically pure information gathering events. They're more, can I get a good news clip? Can I appear on the right side of this? How should an executive prepare, and how should the technical staff prepare their executive to prepare?
Well, Congress is an interesting audience, I would say.
Yes.
The reality is that we definitely counsel organizations. One of the biggest things is ownership. People have to take ownership of what has happened. And that's got to be the initial starting point for anything in terms of crisis communications. When people skip that step, the reputation damage is very difficult to recover from. It doesn't matter if 1 week later they're telling the story of, yes, well, mea culpa, this was where we had a gap. Doesn't matter at that point. You need to step out right away with clear ownership of things that really, truly were a gap.
And then that's kind of interesting because a lot of times you'll see this with apologies too.
Yes.
Where people will give sort of an apology, I'm sorry that, and then tell you all the reasons it's not their fault.
Yeah.
So because you want to explain what happened and what went wrong, but you also want to take ownership, how do you walk that line? Do you give people any advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you absolutely have to take ownership. You have to be very clear about what went wrong. And the most important thing is then bridging as quickly as you can, right, to lessons learned and what's already underway in order to remedy this in the future. And that's got to be a really quick bridge. The quicker you can get to that bridge, the better off you're going to do.
And that would probably be true not just talking to Congress, but in general. That's in front of the media, that's to your customers. Even if you were, let's say you had an incident and you were one of these companies that had 15, 20 important customers, would you have that conversation with each of them and do that kind of ownership, bridge, lessons learned response?
Absolutely. And that's one of the places where we see a lot of reputation damage these days, by the way. When people go to prepare, they need to be thinking about that entire ecosystem and your whole supply chain. And it actually makes a lot of sense in this day and age to involve some of your suppliers in your supply chain as well in some of these conversations so that you're all teed up.
Yep, sure.
Beyond just your organization, but also that supply chain. And yes, you can envision that maybe you and a partner might be addressing a customer then and going through that process.
Well, that's great. I really appreciate you coming down and talking to people who don't do a lot of what you do. I know you're going to be around for most of the day today.
I will be.
So if you have a question about reputation management, make sure you check out Jennifer. And please, thank you for coming.